Hello and welcome guys. Today in our video we will be dealing with strict liability. It is a topic under torts law. So what we will be dealt in today our video is the relation between strict liability and absolute liability in mathematical expression. Second thing will be concept of strict liability. Okay. Third thing is essentials. Essentials of strict liability. Fourth thing is applicability. Applicability in real life. 2-3 examples will be given for applicability. Fifth is exceptions of strict liability. So, in today's video, you will learn that absolute liability is related with strict liability. So, basically, this video will clear your both the concepts regarding two topics of law of torts. So, starting with the first topic, that is concept. So, what is the concept of strict liability? From where it is drawn, or what is the definition of strict liability? It will be dealt in this heading only. So, starting with the first topic, that is concept. So, what is the concept? Strict liability can be defined as a liability on a person for his acts where no mens rea is involved and he is punished because his acts has directly or indirectly indulged into the damages to another person. Or we can say his acts are so eminently dangerous that they result in damage to other person when their acts gone out of control. So first thing that can be under the concept is no mens rea. There is no mens rea, no specific intention of the person who is causing damage to other person. No mens rea is there. Second thing is act. That is dangerous. Dangerous act that cause in damages to other party. Damages to other party. Damages to other party. When the damages are caused is when the act or product, you can say act or product, escapes from the control of the person because of whom the damages are caused. From the control of person owning it. So, this is basically the concept of strict liability where you can define the strict liability. Now comes from where the concept was first drawn. So, it was drawn in the case of Rayland versus Fletcher. Rayland versus Fletcher. So, this was very important case and you have to mention this case for understanding of strict liability. So, for law students who are appearing for any kind of examination, you have to mention this case in your answer sheets to get better marks. So, what was this case? In this case, Fletcher was defendant and Fletcher wants to construct a reservoir on his land. For that purpose, he contracted independent contractor. These are the keywords. Independent contractor. And while the construction, the reservoir overflows to the mines of Rayland. And because of this overflowing, the water that overflowed from the reservoir of the defendant, the plaintiff suffers damages. So it was held by the court that because the decision to construct a reservoir was of defendant, hence it was the duty of defendant to make sure that his decisions, his acts does not cause damage to any other person. Hence the penalty was taken from Fletcher and the strict liability concept was derived in this case only. And now we will come to next topic, that is essentials of strict liability. So what are the essentials? Of strict liability? So first essential is there must be act or product that is dangerous or hazardous. Okay, act or product. Second thing is escapes. Third is non-natural use of land. Fourth is damages. So damages is that essential where any offense, for the occurrence of any offense, this essential is very much important. If there is no damage, either legal, this can be legal or physical. Okay, so damages can be of two types, legal damage or physical damage. So any kind of damage can be done. So for any offense, for the occurrence of any offense, for essentials of any offense, this part is common. Now we will come to what is act or product. The act or product here refers to the dangerous or hazardous act that a person owes, and on his responsibility that the act or product will not escape the premises where it is kept. If it escapes, then there was damages. So what is non-natural use of land? Non-natural use of land is something that clearly indicates for the person to be liable under strict liability, there must be non-natural use of land. If there is natural use of land, then in that case, the person will not be liable under strict liability. So, here non-natural use of land is mandatory, act or product is mandatory, that is dangerous or hazardous, and escape. The act or product must escape the premises where it is kept, and non-natural use of land and the damages caused to another person, because of which the cause of action arises. Because without damages, no cause of action arises. So, these are the essentials of strict liability. Now we will come to applicability. So, starting with applicability. Applicability is something where you can apply this concept. So, I will discuss two cases where you can apply, but there are many other. So, first case is on product default. On product default. You can apply the concept of strict liability if there is default on the part of product. So, strict liability will be applicable on the manufacturer of the product. Second thing is on attack of animal. So, on case of attack of animal, suppose A keeps a dog owned by A only to his house, and one night dog escapes from the house and causes damages to D. So, D will claim the damages from A because the dog was dangerous, dog was eminently dangerous, or you can say dog can cause many kind of harms, even dog can cause death. So it was the responsibility of A to keep the dog in the premises where it was intended to be kept, and if the dog escapes, then the damages caused by the dog to any person will be claimed by that person from the owner of the dog. So A will pay the damages to D, to medical expenses, to any other expenses where the courts allow, then A will pay the damages to D. So this is example of attack of animal where the concept of strict liability is applicable. Now the last topic is exceptions. Exceptions. So what are the exceptions? First exception is act of God. The act of God. So what is act of God? Act of God, I will explain you this exception with an example. Suppose A is having a horse on his farm. B is having harmful plants. And if the act of God can be explained by this way, that if the harmful plants, fruits from harmful plants falls on the land on the farm of A, and the horse consumes those fruits, then in that case B will not be liable for the damages caused to A, because the act of God was involved, and because of the winds or because of any other factor that is occurring naturally, the fruits or the harmful plants or any other cause left the premises and caused damages to other person. So B will not be responsible for the damages caused to A. So this is an exemption of strict liability. Second exception is plaintiff's default. So second exception is plaintiff's default. So what is plaintiff default? In this example only I will explain you this exception also. Suppose A A's horse left the farm and went to the farm of B where harmful plants were there, and A's horse consumes those plants or the fruits of those plants and dies. In that case, A cannot claim the damages from B because he is on the default part. Because of his mistake, A's horse left the farm, and due to which he enters to the farms of B and consumes those harmful fruits. So B will not be liable for A's damages. So this is plaintiff's default. Now third is third parties act. What is third parties act? Suppose any other person, suppose C. What C does is he placed the fruits from farm of B in the farm of A, and this horse consumes those fruits placed by C in the farm of A, and then the horse dies. So in that case, A cannot claim the damages from B because the act of placing the harmful fruits in the farm of A was done by C. So here no damages can be claimed from B. So this is third parties act. Now fourth is, what is fourth? Fourth is simple, the plaintiff's consent. Plaintiff's consent. Fourth is plaintiff's consent. If plaintiff consented towards something, towards some act, then he must, it is presumed that he must be knowing the consequences of his consent, and that then the maxim known as volenti non fit injuria is applicable. So plaintiff will be responsible for his acts, and if he consented something, then in that case the volenti non fit injuria will be applicable, that he must be knowing of his acts, his consent, his risk in his consent, so he cannot claim damages. So these are the exceptions. Now we come to the main part, that is relation between absolute liability and strict liability. So you will be clear about absolute liability as well in the single video with those mathematical relations. So starting with the relation. So absolute liability is something where there is no exception. So you can directly relate absolute liability is equals to strict liability minus exceptions. So if I use a single word mathematical equation, then I will use absolute liability as A is equals to strict liability as S and exceptions as E. So S minus E. So this is a mathematical expression from where you can understand the concept of absolute liability, and while attempting the question you can straight away apply this concept, and if there lies no exception, in that case the penalty will be absolute liability. If there lies any exception, or depends on question to question, if there lies any exception, then it will be strict liability. So this is all about the concept of absolute liability and strict liability. Hope you like the video. If you do so, then you can just share the video, or you can ask any of the question regarding to any field of law in the comment section. So thank you for watching and stay tuned for further updates.